Welcome, everybody. I think we're going to get started in about a minute. So go ahead and take your seats if you don't have one already. And thank you so much for sticking around. We've got two more presentations. First one by myself, Jim Puckett, Executive Director of the Basel Action Network and founder of Estewards. And then following that, we are going to present with Bill Morris an Estewards program called Advanced Plus, which I think you're going to be very interested in checking out. We have a new short film on that program we'll be showing for the first time. So, thank you again for coming. Today, I'm going to do a helicoptering exercise, up, and a bit into the past and into the future. So it's very easy to get into the nitty-gritty of everything we deal with in every day, but because I've been in this space business for at least 2 decades, I think it's time to take stock. So that's what I want to do today. So I'm going to start with a chronology of the last 20 years that I've been involved in, milestones, and then make some historic conclusions of what we've done in those 20 years, how far we've come. And then I'm going to start looking at some of the issues of the future. And I could spend, could write a book on this. And we've touched on a lot of things, like in the last session, there were some really interesting discussions. But I'm going to focus in on one aspect of what we have been remiss and really pressing for, and that is designing for circularity. And that's a big topic in itself. So I'm going to touch on it, but I think it's really something we need to do in the next 10 years. And so that's going to be my main issue of the future. Then I'm going to look at a potential future chronology that we can dream about, and you can add to that list, and then take any questions you might have. So looking at the last 20 years, we first got involved, and that's me there 20 years ago, when we discovered that most of the electronic waste that we were producing in North America, at least, and a lot of it in Europe, was going to China. And we were the first group to go over there and document that with the film and report we did called Exporting Harm. That changes the nature of this industry dramatically, and has changed my life dramatically, because I've been working on it ever since, and a lot of you have as well. Following that, people said, holy crap, we got to do something. This industry is not acting like an industry, it's acting like a criminal activity, and we have to do something about it. So some of the things that happened internationally is that some partnerships were formed. At the Basel Convention, they started with mobile phones in PPI. They then moved on to Partnership for Action on Computing Equipment, PACE, and then the STEP program was launched by the United Nations University. And then came the voluntary certifications. R2 and Estewards sprang from the same process that EPA pulled together a bunch of stakeholders, says we have to do something better. A lot of it was driven by that exporting harm. I have to say that was really the kicker that moved everyone into action, that we have to do better. WELABEX was a certification that was created shortly thereafter in Europe. So then the next report we did was about another continent, Africa, the digital dump. We were showing that a lot of the exports were being driven by the same dynamic of trying a cheap and dirty way to get rid of stuff or to have it managed on the cheap. And that was a little different in that those container loads were full of stuff that could be repaired as well as total junk. So it was a mix. So the recipient would dump the stuff they couldn't deal with and try to get enough value out of what they could repair and sell in the African marketplace. A really ugly situation we documented in Lagos, Nigeria. That spurred the Basel Convention to get totally involved at their COP8 meeting in Nairobi. They had the Nairobi Declaration, which really got everyone focused at the Basel Convention on e-waste, like no other issue. E-waste dominated Basel ever since, until very recently with plastics. That created the African E-Waste Project. $1 billion plus was donated from the European Commission to work on African situations with e-waste. Then something that really mobilized people in this country is 60 Minutes got on the case, did the most rewarded program called The Wasteland that's ever been a 60 Minutes episode. Got all kinds of awards. There I am with Scott Pelley in Guiyu, China, and showing what happened just following waste from a take-back event in Colorado all the way through Hong Kong into mainland China, into Guiyu. Then we had laws, we just talked about them in the last session. What are these EPR laws that 23 states enacted to try to keep things out of the landfill? Ironically, because of the Commerce Clause in the United States Constitution, the diversion from landfill often meant more was being exported because the states couldn't control export legally. So that's been a kind of a sad story, but it does show the inclination that there was a need to do something legislatively like Europe did. Talked about it in the last session as well. There has not been a national legislation in the US, so it is a patchwork. 25 states with EPR laws in 2013. This picture, very interesting. This is Guiyu, China, the place we first saw everything was happening on the downside of what was happening with the industry and this particular consumer product. These chimneys are retrofitted into all the houses in this town of Guiyu. And they're chimneys retrofitted because on the other side of them are these women that were burning circuit boards or cooking circuit boards in these shallow pans, and that's lead solder that she's dealing with there. Cooking them, pulling off the chips, trying to get value out of those chips, those different resistors and such, and breathing in the fumes, which are highly toxic. So that's why they had the fans and the chimneys, but of course they were not perfect, and these people got exposed, and they're working, you know, every day of the week for long hours doing this cooking. I'm talking thousands of women doing this. Every townhouse was converted in this way. So when we finally, in 2015, after so long, 15 years almost, of trying to get China to close all this stuff down and to put some kind of regulation in China, they finally did it. And now what I saw the next year when I went to Guiyu was very symbolic. These were the chimney holes filled up, shut down, closed up with cement, whatever they had to throw them in there. But you can still go to Guiyu and see these filled up chimney holes as a legacy of that whole period of 15 years of burning circuit boards, the major occupation for that part of China. Thank you. Thank you. But we all did it. This is a 20-year history of what we woke up to and said, okay, we have to do better. These are the milestones, and we've obviously got a ways to go, right? This slide I took in Zanzibar. This is a typical situation where they're trying their best in the marketplaces in Africa. This happens every day in every part of Africa to try to reuse, try to repair, but ultimately the things will get dumped. And the problem that happened at the Basel Convention is the OEMs went in there and said, okay, we would like to make an exemption for repairables. And we said, well, if you really had control of those repairables, that would be great. But once you take them out of the convention legal framework, there's nothing you can do. It's a major loophole. People can just say, I'm going to repair it. Don't worry, I don't have to be regulated. So we said, that's not a good idea. They put that bad idea into a technical guideline, adopted it on an interim basis. It's still a big fight going on about that. And so it's interimly adopted, and there is a major controversy going there. I'll explain in a bit. So that happened in 2015. In 2014 through 2017, we decided, because certain entities were saying this waste trade is really not happening anymore, don't worry about it. The data shows there's really not any problem. So we put GPS trackers all over the US, 300 of them. And as you know, we produced a report called Scam Recycling and followed those trackers and found out that most of them were no longer obviously going to Guiyu. They'd really shut it down. They were going to Hong Kong, which used to be the staging location for bringing things into Guiyu. And Hong Kong then started to actually be doing recycling rather than just staging the smuggling. And really dirty recycling, using a lot of immigrant labor, people from the Philippines, from Burma, et cetera. So our trackers found all these places. And we exposed them all in the eTrash Transparency Project. And in 2018, as a result of doing press there and press the US, those were shut down. So Hong Kong now, you do not find these places in Hong Kong If you see things going into Hong Kong in a bill of lading or something, they're being transshipped. This type of activity is really not taking place there anymore. So that was another real success story. Then this whole industry migrated from the China area and Hong Kong to Southeast Asia. And this picture was taken in Thailand. I went there before the pandemic and found this facility, which is very sadly typical, set up by the Chinese businessmen when they were closed out of Guiyu. And they started bringing it all into the farmland area of Thailand. So this is basically a dioxin factory, I like to call it, because they're just burning circuit boards, which are full of brominated flame retardants, which make brominated dioxins. And the smoke is belching out over a dairy farm, as it turns out. And this is going on, and had been going on in Southeast Asia, had been going on in Thailand. Thailand, though, banned the trade in 2020. So a lot of what made the shift to Southeast Asia is also not only they closed Guiyu, but China got really serious about any type of waste coming in with their national stored policy. And fortunately, they were smart enough to make more than just a policy. They harnessed an army of customs agents and really were draconian about the penalties for anybody smuggling. So our GPS trackers now, we put them out there still. We have them routinely going through our Estewards facilities. If we were ever to find them going anywhere offshore, they don't go to China. China has really clamped down on the trade. So in 2019, the Basel ban, which I spent most of my life working on, which is the idea that was originally going to be the Basel Convention, was that there would be a ban on the trade of all types of hazardous waste from the rich OECD countries to the poorer non-OECD countries. That ban, despite a lot of setbacks and pushback from countries like the United States, came into force in 2019. So right now, for Basel parties, which the US is not, they're not able to send hazardous electronic waste to developing countries. It's a major development. For the US, it means not as much, of course, but the US not being a party, they're not supposed to trade with Basel parties anyway. So then we have plastics. The next big milestone was the Basel Convention started to regulate plastics. And in 2019, they adopted new controls on plastic waste trade. We have some webinars on this if you want to really know what was done and what it all means for the electronics industry especially, because we deal with a lot of plastics, as you know. And so that was adopted in 2019, went into force in 2021. Also has to be mentioned, although BAN doesn't directly work on this issue, I think it's an amazing campaign, and that is getting design for repair to be a real thing, to be legislated, to be required of manufacturers. And we had a major milestone in the EU legislation. And at the meeting I was just at in June, at the last conference of parties, 22 developing countries took the floor and said, we want to close this repairability loophole that's in the guideline. We really want to work further on that and fix that. So they're starting to see the problem of having that massive loophole that the OEMs really fought for. And so I think we're going to probably win the day on that, that the dividing line between what is a waste and a non-waste will be functionality, which is what the original policy was at Basel. So if it's not functional, it's not tested, it's a waste, and there will be controlled potentially under Basel. So, then we had New York, the first state to pass a right to repair law. I think there's going to be a lot of them sweeping forward across the country at the state level. And also at this last June meeting, the Swiss-Ghana Amendment was adopted, and I have a webinar on that, which you can pull from our website as well, the Estewards website, that explains what that means for US recyclers, for example. But basically, in a nutshell, they have decided to control, not as hazardous waste, but as something that has to be controlled as a special waste, all types of e-waste, whether they're hazardous or not. So, and then the other milestones were here. And we're looking at 20 years back. And this is as good a time as any to take stock of that and to perhaps be proud of how far we've come. So let's see what we've really done, what we put in the bag, and it's starting to really improve. Increasingly, exporting e-waste problems to developing countries is illegal. Increasingly, it's demonized. Even when it's not illegal, it's shameful. You can see there's a curve that's just increasing all the time, new countries banning it on their own nationally, et cetera. In the US, where it's not illegal because of the Basel Convention, there still have been prosecutions with prison sentences, which is actually more than you can say for Europe. People have gone to jail over this issue, mostly on fraud. And in my view, although we have no hard data, the export of US hazardous e-waste has come down since 20 years ago from about 80% of what would be delivered to recyclers would go offshore. It's down to, I believe, about 25%. And I base that just on the anecdotal information we get from our trackers and from the field. I think it's really come down. We're still getting a few trackers that are GPS trackers showing up places like Pakistan and Malaysia. But it's really come down, and so that's really kudos to you guys. You took it on yourselves to clean up your act. And of course, there's competitors who are still doing it, but we're going to work on them. And we now have a national bill that is hoping to get it passed finally in this Congress. It's getting bipartisan support. It's called the CERA, and that's in place, and so I really urge you to support it. The group that was formed to push for that bill, the Coalition for American Electronics Recyclers, CAER, I encourage you, if you're not a member, to join that. It's got 124 recycling members right now, and they're all supporting CERA. So that's a huge milestone. And I would be remiss not to remind that when we started, there were 0 certifications. 0. And there was great skepticism there would ever be any. We now have more than 1,000. So that's incredible. The certifications, they're different. We really think ours is the superior one, of course. But just having that certification is a mile of difference compared to not being introspective enough and being able to brag about what you're really doing and really stand by it with third-party audits, et cetera. So it makes for a very different industry to be certified. GPS tracking is now a proven means of due diligence and enforcement in some cases. We have certain of the states that do the EPR laws for their states that are using our GPS tracking. Companies like Samsung are using our GPS tracking routinely, et cetera. Some of the companies we can't talk about. Half of the US states, as I mentioned, have laws to help consumers recycle e-waste. And the right to repair movement is now gaining awareness and law. Manufacturers have begun to start phasing out toxics and certainly single-use plastics in their packaging. That's huge, and I'll talk about that when I talk about designing for circularity. The abandonment of warehouses full of CRTs, et cetera, and landfilling of digging holes and throwing CRTs into them is no longer common. We're kind of like cleaning up the last bits of that mess, I hope, but that used to be really commonplace. Facilities now opening for US plastics recycling separation to start to deal with how are we going to meet the demands of the plastic challenge. I think that's positive. And industry starting to embrace ESG, environmental justice, which we've spoken about many times, which I'll always speak about, and very related, the ethical circular economy. So I'm going to talk about how the term circular economy has been co-opted, so we always like to talk about a real and ethical circular economy. So that, I got more. E-cyclers survived the pandemic, and actually a lot of them thrived because they were in the ITAD space, and there was a huge demand. So not only did you survive the pandemic, a lot of them thrived, and they served the pandemic with all those people working at home. So that was a terrific milestone. And bad actors have been forced out of the business. I don't know if you remember these names, but Intercon Solutions, Executive, Closed Loop, 5R, MPC, GES, Diversified all come to mind. Forced out. More emphasis now on reuse, ITAD as we like to call it, rather than only materials recovery, really important. And more social impact programs, digital equity, workforce inclusion, for example, and Bill's going to speak about our Advanced Plus program after I'm done here. So, e-cyclers that are in the room and they're not in the room, that have donned your protective masks and really taken on the challenges that we just first started discovering 20 years ago, I think you should all, take a bow. We can really be proud in this industry of what we've done in 20 years. And because we kind of paved the way, I think the next set of achievements that will equal to the last 20 years might only take 10 years. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. So the issues of our future that I'd really like to delve into a little bit here. Looking at the circular economy, this is the original diagram, and I hate to say it, but the circular economy has come to mean something else to so many people than what was originally envisioned. Everybody focused on the center of this diagram, all those lovely circles and arrows that are looping things back, very theoretically, but very promisingly, to loop things back, recycle, reuse, etc. They forgot the first challenge which was identified. But the one that we all look at is optimized resource yields by recirculating products and components, etc. That's what we're all very familiar with. What was forgotten was the first principle, which was to preserve and enhance natural capital, so to recognize that nature has value, and it has services that it provides the world, and we have to calculate those into the economy, and when we lose those, we lose much. And then we also, the one I'm most concerned about in my career, is designing out and revealing negative externalities. So the most classic negative externality is dumping the waste on developing countries, where nobody has to pay that bill. Nobody's going to present you with a bill for the damage you caused in China. And they're talking about minimizing systematic leakage and negative externalities. Well, if you don't do that, you're not going to have anything resembling a circular economy. So, but there's another issue that they left out. So there's a fourth principle that I think the circular economy should have really emphasized, and it has to do with this picture, this cartoon of the classic analogy of people running around with mops before turning off the tap to try to clean up the mess. And it's about moving upstream and designing out waste and designing everything we do for circularity. If you don't do that, you're not going to have a circular economy. So I would scratch this diagram. We're going to have to make a new poster. The part that I'm going to add is a new number 1, which is designed for circularity. And I'll get into what all that means. There's a new hierarchy that I think we all should look at, and particularly we have to find the ways to make the OEMs look at this, because they're the ones doing the design at the moment. So we need to design with the entire life cycle in mind. The electronics industry track record of this, I don't think we're learning much if we really look back. We think about things we've done with design that have turned out to be just disasters for society. I don't know how many billions, but I think it's probably in the trillions of dollars that has been spent to mitigate the decision to use polychlorinated biphenyls in electronics and other uses back in the day. The hassle of the cost that has been spent to deal with that and pull them out of the environment, unbelievable. Just on a design decision, we can use this material. Nobody did the product impact assessment. Nobody does product impact assessments. So that's one classic example, if we look back through history, of just a design decision that nobody had input into and has created a disaster. Likewise, when we created CRTs, they actually turned out to have a very long life, but nobody ever thought about how we're going to recycle a CRT. Nobody ever thought that when they designed it. And now we haven't learned with the flat screen issue. Nobody ever thought, well, these CCFLs we use have mercury in them. We got to make it really easy to pull those tubes out at end of life. But no, you guys have all had to deal with that. Those tiny little tubes that you have to pull out basically by hand, they're impossible to remove, and it makes it so it's very difficult to repair. You don't have like a cassette of CCFLs you can just slide in. This is another example. And the future, we're making the same mistakes. Internet of Things devices in clothing, in furniture, in your car parts, etc. How the heck are you going to get that hardware out of all those little devices? Every one of them is going to be a new set of hardware that nobody has designed a collection system for. How are you going to locate them? How are you going to pull them out? How are you ever going to manage them? So are we learning? I don't think so. Lithium-ion batteries. We've done a deep dive into how these are being proposed to be recycled, and it's really very primitive right now. There's some dreams of doing some amazing things, but we are almost peaking in the next 10 years or so of a massive amount of lithium-ion batteries, and the best they've got right now really is to mix them all up into a black mass and send them to a smelter. I mean, there are some folks working on this, sure, but man, they're way behind where we need to be. And photovoltaics the same way. We get what we get, and they basically say, well, here's the product, you figure out how to recycle it, you recyclers. That's what they do. That's where we live. And that's why it's so important we figure out how to tackle this in the next 10, 20 years, because so much of the waste and the whole issue of sustainability with electronics resides with the design, of course. So these are the future issues which they've not planned for, but you're going to have to deal with. So what we really need to do is delve into these issues. This is the hierarchy. Is first you look at how do we fill the societal need. You don't just say we need a product. We figure out what's the need and what's the lowest impact way to fulfill that need. Next, you don't put things that are toxic, obviously. Toxic in, toxic out, someone's going to suffer down the road. So you make things toxic free. And you also assume that some things are going to become toxic if they're dealt with badly. So you have to assume for worst case disposal. When I talk to OEMs, they go, oh, don't worry, we're getting toxic free. And I say, what about this plastic case? What if it gets burned? And they go, oh, we'll never advocate for open burning. I say, you don't have to advocate for it, that's what happens. When this thing has a second life in Africa, and then it has a third life, and then it finally gets dumped in Africa, it's going to be burned. I'll show you some pictures on that in a bit here. Design with circular materials. Design for longevity. Design for repairability. For upgradability and harvesting of parts. For collectability. For easy 100% recycling reuse. So that is the checklist that we need our designers, our manufacturers, to run through to avoid what we're living with now as recyclers at the bottom of the food chain. So here's some examples of trying to fulfill a societal need. We have a societal need to mix our milk and our coffee together. So we have swizzle sticks. This is a classic example. But you would start to use your pinky instead of using a swizzle stick if you really did an impact assessment life cycle of the fossil fuel manufacturing, extraction, et cetera, to make a swizzle stick, to add the toxic additives that make the colors and the flexibility and all that. By the time you've got that swizzle stick created, not even thinking about the end of life of it, you've already completely outweighed the usefulness of mixing your coffee. You never want to mix your coffee with a swizzle stick again. And yet we make these because we don't think about the whole life cycle. And another way to think outside the box that has happened recently is with the shared economy. The societal needs, we need to move persons from A to B. We have a finite number of cars. Why should we build more cars or taxis when we have all kinds of cars, we can share them? So the shared economy, same with Airbnb and hotels. Shared economy is a really outside the box way of fulfilling a societal need without creating waste. And we have the lease economy, which I love, of course, the idea that you don't have to own everything. And if you don't own stuff, and the manufacturer or leaser is the one that owns it, they'll have much more of an incentive to design for circularity because they don't want to create waste that they're responsible for. They don't want to create toxic waste, so they'll have an incentive to design with no toxicity, et cetera. So a lease-based economy could be very good for us if we can get over the hang-up of having to own everything. And I think young people are going more and more in that direction. Design toxic-free. This is a page from Apple, sustainability report, and they're bragging that they're taking these things out, lead, beryllium, PVC, et cetera. Very laudable that they're doing this, and they need to take it even further. But you don't see many people marketing a toxic-free phone or a toxic-free computer yet. We'll know we're there when that happens. And design for worst-case disposal, as I mentioned, the OEMs are always horrified when they say your product's going to be burned. Don't even think about it. It's almost assuredly going to be burned. This is a dump in Africa. It's just so typical. This is outside of a town, and they're always burned. And in those dumps, you will find circuitry, and that's where it ends up. designed with circular materials. I talked about plastic. I've done a deep dive in the last 2 years into plastic. And we all know the story of the emperor with no clothes, and we've all heard that, don't worry, we can recycle, don't worry, we can recycle the plastics. I'm here to tell you that it's nonsense. Of course you can do some form of recycling of plastic, but is it truly circular? Shh, no. The little child is going to say, no, you're not wearing any clothes. Plastics, when you dig into them, are not inherently a circular product. And they could be maybe someday, but it's a long way off that day. What people often don't understand is plastics are not recycled, they are downcycled. So the polymer chain shortens after 1 or 2 cycles, and they have to be mixed with virgin. Also, plastic is so cheap always that it cannot compete with virgin plastic. And it's so cheap that nobody has an incentive to really collect it. So it's very difficult to collect all uses of it. And there's so many types of polymers. They haven't narrowed them down, and we haven't really focused on how to recycle any of them very well. And so cleaning and separation is extremely difficult, and you're talking about something that's not very profitable anyway. And then there's the horrible situation that people like to ignore, that there's always additives. There's never a pure plastic polymer in use in the market. It's always mixed with colorants, flexibilizers, flame retardants, you name it. A lot of those are harmful, endocrine disruptors, cancer-causing, et cetera. And the life cycle analysis that have been done on plastic that show that plastic is better, in some cases, almost always ignore the additives costs. And they focus in on the fact that it's lighter, and if you're going to send it 1,000 miles, it's going to be more harmful for the environment. So those are just some of the issues. Burning it releases sequestered carbon, so that's not an answer for energy recovery. And again, due to polymer chain shortening, it demands more virgin to actually be produced. So if you really look at plastics, there is an industry that's turning them into pellets and flakes, but it's downcycling. And it's not like we would like to think of recycling, like taking copper and making copper and glass and making glass. It's not one-to-one. So that's why I say that it's really not inherently circular. It might be a controversial thing to say, but it's what I've determined. Chemical recycling is also a unicorn. It's not anything but a fantasy right now. It takes so much energy to do it that everything that's been tried out so far is a non-starter. So final word on plastics. If you just look at the history of how long we've been talking about recycling plastics, since 1980 to 2018, there you see the graph. The green line on the bottom is the recycling rate. So that's how successful we've been. The line that's moving up and up is the consumption of plastic, the growth of use of plastics. So we're losing that battle terribly. And look at it compared to metals. Metals have very high recycling rates in some instances, always better than plastic because they have inherent value. They're one-to-one recycled, they don't have the additives, et cetera. And I'm sure you as recyclers, if given the choice, you would much rather have metals to deal with and recycle metals than plastic. So I've actually been talking to some of the manufacturers about that. Getting to the issue of longevity, this has come from Bill's Blue Star Recycler. They actually got this in the door as a TV. It's a Philco 1959 television, very elegant. The console part would go near your couch and the other part would go across the room. The other part is made with the CRT and metal. It's actually pretty awesome looking. And it wasn't working, but look what good shape it's in. It probably wouldn't take much to fix it. And that's 63 years old. If you think back at all the appliances in our house, they were designed for at least longevity of 20 years when we were growing up. Refrigerators and toasters and things are all expected to last at least that long. And nowadays we're talking 2 or 3 year lifespans. So who are the manufacturers talking about longevity? They're starting to talk about it, and I'm always very skeptical that they're really taking it seriously at all levels of a corporation because it works against their bottom line, of course, to have their products last a long time, or you would think so. And these are the mentions in all of these companies' sustainability reports, how many times the word longevity or durability is mentioned. And you can see that Apple is leading the way. A lot of them don't mention it at all. And Apple's actually put a chapter in their sustainability report about longevity. So they're going all in. And so we'll see how that works out. So they're going to tell you that you buy an Apple product, it's going to last a lot longer. So we'll see. Repairability, this is where Apple doesn't do so well. So recycling really isn't the answer, as has been said a couple of times here at this conference. It's the last resort. But don't worry, if you do recycling, it's the last resort that's necessary. It's absolutely necessary because there's some things you're just not to be able to repair. And so, but you do need to have the mindset that recycling isn't the first thing you want to do. It's really the last. So looking at the issues of design for repairability, there's a report card done by US PIRG, and you can see Apple's not doing so well. They're getting D's and F's because of their glued-in batteries and things like that. So that's an important issue to bear in mind. It's an important issue to really make the OEMs sit and think about. So I'm glad there's a report card going. We got to do a lot more. And upgradability, it's the next thing on the hierarchy. And there's only one really good example I know about, and that's the Fairphone. It's only available in Europe, but this phone is amazing. They've made everything modular. You can pull the bits out and they can be replaced with an upgrade. Easy to repair, easy to fix. It got 10 out of 10 at iFixit's report card. And it's incredible. Why Apple can't do this? It's just so elegant. So that's designed for upgradability. Designed for collectability. I mentioned the Internet of Things. How the hell are you going to collect all those little monitors and sensors? We didn't design them for that. And there's only been one article that I know about that's written on this problem, and it's this one here, and it was only like 5 paragraphs long. So nobody has really taken a deep dive into this that I know about. But it is a terrible problem. If you expect circularity, you expect recycling to happen, you have to be able to collect the stuff. And we're going the other way. We're going to electronics in our clothes and our furniture, et cetera. How are you going to find them? Are you going to put RFID tags in them? That might work. Some way to scan a whole house and pull them out easily. I haven't seen any thinking on this. Finally, just doing all the things that when you're in your recycling stations on your work floor, that you just shake your head and, God, why didn't they design it? Why didn't they put a different, why didn't they put screws in here? What are they doing mixing all these things? It's impossible to take this thing apart. So ease in separating components and materials, no unusual materials, alloys, mixtures you can't recycle. Use the same and limited number of valuable polymers. Have the same type of chargers, eliminate BFRs. Make things modular. Use more valuable materials, metal instead of plastic. Don't require special tools, just slows everything down. Do not use glues. Provide manuals, parts, and tools. These are all on the designers. We should not be in this passive position of saying, well, that's what we get. That's it. We have to deal with it. We're recyclers. We don't have any say. Talking about having say, you know, the OEMs have a really good feedback mechanism with the manufacturers. They have, so the OEMs here are the designers, of course. They have a pretty good feedback mechanism with retailers. So that's green for good. The users, there's a feedback mechanism whether they buy it or not, but they're not a very informed user as to what the life cycle impacts are. So the feedback, you don't have consumers telling Apple what to do. They just get products and they buy them or not. Feedback mechanism, very weak. Then we have repair, and it's just starting to happen that the repair people are saying, hey, Apple, what are you doing using glue? So it's not a very good communication going on there. And then the recyclers, bottom of the food chain. How much say do you have on what Dell, HP is making? Not very much. You have no leverage. And that's what's got to change in the next, hopefully, 10 years. We need to get that leverage. We need to find a way to do it. I think we start with pushing them into voluntary stakeholder sessions with every section of the life cycle being represented with stakeholders that meet with the designers and talk about their perspective, because we're missing so much of the circularity without this feedback. If people were so serious about having circularity, then there would be true equality and circularity and transparency with all of these life cycle sectors. So just to wrap up, recycling reuse should no longer be reactionary activity, an afterthought. Every part of the life cycle of products should have equal consideration during design. Right now it does not. It's the last consideration for end of life. Not only material flow should be circular, but life cycle intelligence should be circular, communication. In other words, consumers and recyclers must be part of design decisions. Sounds a little strange, because we're not used to that, but it has to happen. And we have to collaborate on how to make that happen. So finally, I'm running a little bit over here. I'm going to wrap up with a future chronology of what we can hope to do in the next 10 years. Negative externalities, the waste trade, for example, is increasingly eliminated to 5% or less. I told you I think it's about 25 right now. Developing countries, not just China, refuse to import hazardous waste from nations. The US finally ratifies the Basel Convention, including the Basel Ban Amendment. All voluntary certifications align themselves with the Basel Convention. The US passes the CERA Act, more prosecutions and jail time for violators and exporters. More agree to use GPS tracking for transparency, including EPR schemes, et cetera. The Basel Convention closes their repairabilities loophole. The PIC procedure of Basel is streamlined, so it actually, when you do need to move waste, to internalize costs, not externalize costs, to go from, example, developing to developed countries, it's streamlined, it works. The expectation for all recyclers that all private data will be expunged whether the customer wants it or not. Majority of recyclers get involved in providing digital equity programs. Majority of recyclers engage their community in dialogue about local environmental justice issues. They get ahead of this issue. Majority of recyclers employ disabled workforce, such as via the Advanced Plus program. Right to repair laws are codified in US and EU. Lease-based and share-based economy grows. OEMs devise means to easily recycle IoT hardware, PV, and lithium-ion batteries. And finally, OEMs emphasize design for circularity, including going toxic-free, embracing repairability, reducing use of plastic, et cetera. And this is the final wish. And this is something I'm excited about because all recyclers can come together on this. Whether you're R2, Estewards, Rio, CISRI, or whatever, we need to work together with the OEMs to begin a process to seriously tackle upstream design issues. Put them in a little more pressure on the OEMs. Start with a voluntary procedure like I talked about, to have stakeholders that approach them and say, we need to have this dialogue, and really make that happen, because it is a huge stumbling block to true circularity. So thank you. I'm sorry I went a little over time. Stay in place after you ask any questions you might have, because Bill's going to be speaking and showing that film on the Advanced Plus program. Any